Before we jump into clouds, I wanted to sort of give a chance to Pierre-Philippe to introduce the team. I mean, I know, Pierre-Philippe, you're an atmospheric scientist, so I thought this would be much better coming from you than me.
Yes, in fact, I'm actually oceanographer, but because the atmosphere and ocean are so coupled, we have this issue as well. And as you know, cloud is one of the biggest challenge for climate modelers, because most of the uncertainty comes from understanding what's the behavior of clouds, their height, their shape, their properties, optical properties. And FDL did a great job last year in building a data set that the community can use. And this was for me really disruptive, because the traditional way to look at cloud in our community is almost simple statistics about if it's white or not. And having an automatic way to classify this and go through the whole archive is certainly disruptive. And this year, capitalizing on this and looking at the interaction with aerosols even make it more exciting, because both are so coupled that maybe you can learn something on aerosol from cloud and vice versa. So it's highly coupled system, and I'm looking forward to the results. I know the team has been doing a great job and has been led through very good coaching. And let's see what happens so we can better understand our climate.
Thanks, Pierre-Philippe. All right, well, I think Clouds team, are you ready?
Great, thank you, Pierre-Philippe, for a fantastic introduction there. So to kick off the digital showcase, we're the Clouds and Aerosols team, and we're going to be giving you an overview of our work this summer, looking at how trying to unveil the kind of complexities of how pollution affects the behavior of clouds and the impacts of that on the climate. So to begin with, a quick introduction. We're a team of 4 researchers. We have Tim and James, who are researchers on the machine learning side of things. We have Lucas, who is a kind of cross-disciplinary climate researcher. And lastly, myself, I'm a specialist in clouds in atmospheric physics. And then we have the support throughout this project of our fantastic leads. So we have Matt Kusner, who's our machine learning lead, and Matt Christensen, who is a domain lead. And last but not least, we have our super mentor, Duncan, who's been a fantastic support throughout this project. So clouds cover a huge proportion of the Earth's surface. We all know instinctively the effect on the weather when we have clouds. Clouds make it cool, they make it mild. When it's clear, it's hot and dry. And the same is true for the climate as a whole. Clouds almost act as air conditioning for the atmosphere. By reflecting incoming sunlight, they keep the Earth cooler than it would be otherwise. In particular importance are these large decks of marine boundary layer, so close to the surface clouds, that cover vast areas of the Earth's oceans, particularly off the western seaboard of all the major continents. These clouds cover a huge extent. You're looking at an area kind of similar to the extent of Europe. And these really consistent clouds have an immense impact on the climate. If we were to remove them, then the warming effect could be 10 times as large as all the warming since pre-industrial times. So even if we alter the spread of these clouds, even a small extent through our pollution, through our human activities, we could massively increase the rate at which the climate is warming. And the reality is, we know that we are altering these clouds. The challenge is knowing how much and how that will change in the future. So one of the most complex pollution that we release into the atmosphere is what we call aerosol pollution. You might also know it as particulate pollution. These particulates are released in often the same way as greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels. So some of these we can see are natural. You'll have sand coming off the desert regions, you'll have sea salt and dust, but we'll also have soot and smoke from burning biomass. We'll have sulfuric acid and nitric acid from internal combustion engines. And the effect of aerosols upon the climate is actually a cooling effect. So in this chart here, anything that's to the right is warming. So you see carbon dioxide at the top along with the other greenhouse gases having a large warming effect. But we also have aerosols at the bottom, which have this cooling effect. And not only do they have a direct cooling effect, they also interact with clouds. And in fact, here, what we can see is there's a huge uncertainty, this error bar, in how large that cooling effect due to the interaction with clouds is. And that's a big problem for predicting the future of climate change, because this cooling effect acts as a mask to how severe prior warming already has been. And we can't just extrapolate that, because aerosols have a very short lifetime in the atmosphere. If we were to stop burning all fossil fuels today, the carbon dioxide we've already emitted will on average still be in the atmosphere at the end of the century, whereas the normal lifetime for an aerosol particle in the atmosphere is about a week. That means that once we start making mitigations to climate change, and we're already making mitigations to aerosol pollution because of their health effects, this cooling effect will go away and we'll get increased warming. So we really need to understand how large this cooling effect is to better predict future climate change. So how do aerosols affect clouds? Here's an image of some clouds over the ocean, mostly very thin clouds. And this is about 1,000 kilometers across. So it's a very large area. And you can see within this image, these large streaks of very thick reflective cloud within that. And one of them, which kind of is originating just here, if you looked at this location and zoomed in, you'd likely find probably a cargo ship or maybe a oil transporter, perhaps a cruise liner. These are caused by the pollution from ships' exhausts, burning incredibly dirty fuel. And these aerosol particles from this fuel enhance cloud formation. They form more droplets for water to condense on, which means you have smaller droplets, large surface area, more reflection. And more reflection of sunlight means more cooling. This is known as the primary aerosol effect, or the Toomey effect, and it's relatively well understood, although the magnitude of this cooling is still uncertain. However, the big uncertainty is what happens next. Now you've altered the droplets that make up these clouds. What happens to the clouds as a whole? Do you extend their lifetime? Do you extend how large they spread? Do you reduce rainfall because it's harder to form droplets large enough to start raining? Or do you increase evaporation, so maybe even shorten that lifetime? To the extent of the uncertainty we're talking about, we're not even certain for different clouds whether this will increase or decrease the lifetime of these clouds. And there's a lot of complexity about clouds. As Pierre-Philippe said, one of the most normal ways to look at clouds and the climate is just through bulk statistics. Things like how much water is in a box of clouds like this? What's the average droplet size here? What's the density of droplets? But when we look at them in a high resolution satellite image like this, we can see there's a great deal of complexity. These are not just homogeneous grid cells. So we have several different patterns we can see. Down the bottom right, we have what's called closed cell stratocumulus. This is kind of very dense. Most of the surface is covered by clouds and they reflect a lot of sunlight. Up at the top, we have open cell stratocumulus, where there's these large holes in there, which means a lot of sunlight is getting through and therefore the reflectivity is reduced. We also have more broken structure and then a kind of break up to cumulus, where we have large clouds with gaps between them. And not only do each of these cloud structures change the amount of sunlight that's reflected, but they also change how the clouds evolve over time and respond to pollution. And so we really need to understand more of what's called mesoscale structure, so structure over tens to hundreds to thousands of kilometers of clouds, to really dig into how these lifetime effects will change. And we can see these kind of structures elsewhere. In this bowl of miso soup, you can see these similar patterns with blotchiness and structure with holes and brighter patches showing up. And it's all due to the internal circulations within, in this case, within the soup, in the atmosphere. It's within the lower parts of the atmosphere. And the challenge here, it's almost impossible to actually measure these circulations themselves without being, so to say, in the soup. And we can't do that on the atmosphere. The scales are just too large to get comprehensive measurements. Instead, what we'd like to do is try to gain some understanding of these circulation patterns based on observations of the clouds, and then use that to better understand how these clouds will evolve over time and how they're affected by pollution. So to summarize our science goal, we want to ask the question, how do aerosols influence the occurrence of different cloud types, and how do they influence the evolution and the transition between different cloud types over time? And our kind of hypothesis about this is that in a normal one of these marine clouds, you'd expect to start with this closed cellular structure and over time break up into open cells and then more broken, separated clouds. What we think might happen is that if we increase the number of aerosols, when it forms these closed cell clouds, it delays the formation of rainfall, and this delays the breakup of the clouds, which would be a cooling effect. But why is this difficult to study and understand? Why can't we just kind of observe a cloud type, make some machine learning classifier, and compare that to the measured aerosols? Well, the reality is it's a lot more complicated. There are a lot of processes within these clouds that link aerosols to cloud type, from droplet number density, feedbacks on precipitation, feedbacks on cloud properties, and also feedbacks on this circulation itself. So the clouds change the circulation that causes the cloud structure. And we can't observe this, which makes it very difficult to understand these processes from a purely statistical point of view. So how do we propose to go about this? Well, comparing to the state of the art, our first part is to change from a take of classifying clouds and observing clouds as just snapshots, single points in time, to a time-varying observation of clouds using geostationary imaging satellites. The second part is moving from classifications of clouds based on labeled datasets or unsupervised datasets to self-supervised classification, where we're looking for similar patterns in the clouds, not necessarily those patterns that we expect to see already. And finally, we want to move from this kind of statistical approach to analyzing these clouds to try and remove confounding variables by matching similar meteorological situations and looking at, well, can we find a similar cloud in high and low levels of pollution, to what's more of a causal analysis where we can actually say what happens if we were to change the aerosols within this cloud.
So at a high level, our pipeline consists of these 5 steps. We begin with manipulating our data, which, as we'll describe, we sample through time and space with a moving reference frame. We obtain a cloud type semantic segmentation with unsupervised and self-supervised learning. And we then use these cloud types in a supervised learning problem to estimate the causal effects of aerosols. We, of course, visualize our results, and we qualitatively and quantitatively evaluate them. We obtain a moving reference frame called a Lagrangian reference frame. This essentially allows us to follow a single air pocket through our data. It gives us these nice stabilized views of a cloud where we're confident that each pixel represents the same air mass frame to frame. This acts as a sort of Steadicam and allows our models to focus on the processes within a cloud rather than simultaneously trying to track pixels. This illustration that we're showing here also nicely shows one of the challenges with our data, which is handling these day to night transitions. We have wonderful optical and retrieval bands during the day, but at night we only have infrared bands, which we've shown as false color in these animations. To get around this, we've actually trained our models that we're going to show in this presentation only on these infrared bands, and handling this day to night variability is a great opportunity for future work. So let's get into the technical specifics of the pipeline. Beginning with our data, we have about 4 months of georeferenced satellite data from EUMETSAT Severi sensor and meteorological data from ECMWF's ERA5 dataset and NASA's iMERGE precipitation dataset. We add to this about 4.5 million trajectories, which allow us to follow these air pockets through time. We sample these trajectories using a NOAA software called HiSplit, which we've cloned across 36 environments. In terms of infrastructure, we've made extensive use of the DGX supplied by NVIDIA and SCAN, as well as storage and compute provided by GCP. We developed 3 different models for identifying cloud types, 2 unsupervised models and a self-supervised model. We then use inference from these models to train an RNN for causal analysis of the effect of aerosols on cloud type transitions. And lastly, we have a suite of methods for evaluation and visualization of our results. Looking at our unsupervised models, the first one we use is to replicate the current state of the art from the literature, which is a tile-to-vec triplet loss model. Borrowing intuition from language models, it relies on the assumption that close samples are more similar than distant ones. The second model we implemented is an infogam, similar to a generic generative adversarial network, but an infogam gives the user some control over the features being learned by the model, which we've used to push the model into generating a fixed number of cloud types. Our self-supervised model is a bit of a classic idea, a mixture of experts, but with our loss function, we encourage each expert to specialize in identifying a specific cloud type. We then bring these embeddings together in the mixture assignment network, which chooses which expert to rely on for each pixel. And this is how we obtain a class mapping. These being unsupervised and self-supervised models, we need to very carefully design criteria to evaluate whether they've discovered meaningful cloud types. In our data, we have retrieval properties such as cloud fraction and liquid water path. And so we're able to evaluate whether our cloud types are developing intuitive clusterings based on what we see in the distribution of these properties within the classes. Now again, turning to our science question. What is the effect of aerosols on these cloud type transitions? We have a proxy for aerosols, and we now have cloud types, so can we answer this question? Unfortunately, the causal path between aerosols and cloud type is quite complicated. We need to adjust for the effects of these other observed and unobserved variables. But with many virtual whiteboard hours and the help of our experts, we've been able to find a backdoor adjustment that allows us to marginalize over these other properties, condition on local meteorology, and circumvent these unobserved circulation variables. What this looks like is we use our cloud types as targets in a supervised learning problem. We train an RNN to use as an estimator for different cloud type transitions, and we then integrate over the entire trajectory corpus to marginalize out meteorology, precipitation, and other aerosol effects from previous time steps. And now I'll pass it back to Will to talk about some of our results.
Thanks. So to summarize, we're going to go back to our pipeline and explain how you've achieved each of the goals we set out earlier. So starting off, comparing the segmentation from our 3 models, our baseline unsupervised models, and the mixture of experts, which takes more information in of the time variance of these cloud types. So the existing model that implemented into clouds, we applied to baseline is this tile-to-vec. And we see this assumption that a neighboring tile is the same as the tile you're classifying, means that it struggles to distinguish similar cloud types when you have a steady change from one cloud type to another in the continuous variable. This is actually where the infogam does a lot better because it doesn't make such assumptions. It just relies on a single tile and trying to identify the identifying features of that tile. And so it gets a lot more granularity. And then finally, the mixture of experts allows us to perform true semantic segmentation. So detection of type based on just the single pixel rather than a wider tile. And we see this has benefits in particular areas such as detecting the land and separating that from the rest of the image, which shows that it has a good degree of sensitivity compared to the other models we've implemented. We can then start analyzing when we take a trajectory, how do the cloud types change over time as we look at these trajectories? So here we have an example of following one box where we see a large number of trajectories plotted in the background. And we can see how the proportion of cloud types within one trajectory changes over time. We then use that to feed into a causal mixture model that allows us to predict what we expect the most likely cloud types for a trajectory will be. So here we can look at one trajectory as it passes through the atmosphere for about 3 days. And here's the zoomed in view. And we can see on the right a bar chart of the likelihood of various cloud types and how it evolves over the lifetime of the trajectory. So we have 3 main types here. We have closed cells in brown, open cells in purple, and this kind of broken up cumulus cloud in orange. And we see at the start of the trajectory, it starts out with a mixture of closed cells and open cells. It transfers more to purely open cells and then broken cumulus. which is what we hypothesized in the first place for what we expect these trajectories to look like. Now, what we love to do in this situation is say, well, let's rerun this trajectory, but add a whole load of aerosols to the atmosphere. And that's something you could do with a climate model. But with observational data, you can't do that. We only have one planet to experiment with. So normally how you'd handle this is you'd study a large number of trajectories and you try and match them based on the initial conditions, things like the sea surface temperature, the humidity, and look for trajectories that have matching initial conditions apart from the aerosol loading and see that vary. But using our causal model, we can predict what we'd expect to see in terms of cloud types for a different aerosol loading. So here we've told our causal model that what would you predict if the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere went from a relatively clean situation in the true data to something 10 times as large, so a very polluted atmosphere here. And we do see a significant difference, especially in the lifetime of these open cells clouds before the breakup of the clouds into this broken cumulus. And this shows that we're predicting a significant change in the lifetime of these clouds based on the aerosol loading that our causal network is trained on. And this is an important result because it means we can ingest observational data and then change the aerosol loading to whatever we want it to be and see what the wealth of our data predicts. So to summarize what we've done, we've looked at this data in these Lagrangian viewpoints, which allows us really to focus on the internal changes from the cloud. We've built classification models that classify the clouds over these trajectories, so not just a single point in time, but varying with time. And then we've used these to train a causal model that allows us to ingest real observational data and experiment with it as though we could change the settings as though it were a climate model. Why is this, we think, a really important result and a really powerful result? Is because it means we can perform these kind of experiments with real data. Previously, with climate models, you either have very high resolution climate models that can resolve clouds like these, but only have a short time period and a small spatial extent, or you have large global climate models which can predict the next century of global warming, but their individual grid boxes might be the same as this tile here, so they only represent these clouds as just a set of bulk statistics. Using a model like this, training observational data, means we can contain the complexity of these clouds at high resolution into some causal relationship, which we can use to examine how these clouds change over time with a changing aerosol environment, which allows us to look at the present day climate and say, well, what would happen if we removed all the aerosol? What would happen if we doubled all the aerosol or times it by 10 and perform these experiments using the observational data that we have today? So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I'd like to quickly acknowledge the support we've had through this project. So particularly from the ESA Phi Lab, also from a number of domain experts from both the machine learning side and the clouds and climate side who've been incredibly valuable wealth of knowledge, and also to the team at FDL themselves and all the partners who've made this project possible. So once again, with the Clouds and Aerosols team, thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Clouds team. That was phenomenal and really amazing to see what you've been able to do. I wanted to throw it over to the panel now, Massey, Alison, and Julian, just to say, so what caught your eye, and then, as you were watching, any ideas that it sparked. Of course, there's a strong relationship between aerosols and weather. and then implications, anything that you thought would be sort of useful to feed back to the team.
Yeah. So first of all, such an education. So thank you. Thanks so much, Will, James, and also shout out to Tim and Lucas for fabulous work. I've been doing some personal study this week, actually, because of all the dry lightning that we've been having in the UK. So looking at cloud structure, and it's just fascinating. It really is. I love the fusion of so many techniques that you've used, and of course the thermal infrared, for the fact that you can now look day out or night. Seems very trivial, but such a big change. And I can imagine a future where we're also fusing much more data from right across the electromagnetic spectrum. Actually, visual, for example, we're built for visual, but it's such a tiny fraction of the data that we can actually get from there. So pulling all that in, and there's tons and tons of work as well for thinking about deployment, mask, RCNN, for example, in very low swap for embedded, for intelligent satellites, for example. But I did want to say one thing that I read this week about causal effect and causal discovery. Similar work was actually published in Nature this week, improving clinical diagnosis. So take a look at that, and it's my opinion that this work deserves to be in Nature too. So excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Alison. So Massey, do you want to take the mic?
Sure, my pleasure. So congratulations. I mean, this is actually really exciting work. I want to second actually what Alison said around the fact that integrating the idea of like very, very complex data processing with causal models, I think is really kind of the next steps in the way in which we will apply AI to kind of these very, very challenging problems. And I think actually you guys actually did something really beautiful here in the way in which those things integrated. But actually the other thing actually really caught my eye is that you didn't stop there, and you went actually into this kind of understanding these what if scenarios that I think is really kind of is where science is about. It's actually not just kind of understanding how things work today, but also kind of predicting how they would have worked or how they would work in the future. I think actually this is really, really promising. One thing actually that kind of, I'm hoping actually you guys will continue to study and will kind of scale it out even more, because I think actually kind of one interesting aspect is to validate these models and potentially even kind of expand them even more. By actually running them at a very, very global scale, and then actually kind of correlate actually maybe kind of what are the different percentages of aerosols, and actually how actually those affect actually kind of meteorological weather actually at large scales, as you guys actually kind of pointed out in the introduction. So I'm really looking for how to kind of help you guys actually kind of expand this to even more massive scales. But again, congratulations, because this is really kind of awesome work.
Thanks, Massey. Julian.
Yeah, I mean, the real thing I'm missing today is the ability to clap in real time, because this is really, really excellent work, and you just want to hear the whole crowd clapping and join in. I mean, there's so much to love there, just like Massimo and Alison flagged, from the mixture, how you put together both the segmentation aspect, computer vision, then on top of that start to add some causality, modeling, and look at all that from a full time integration. So here, for the audience, there's a few bits that are really worth highlighting. First, moving from the snapshots to looking at the whole time process. There's so much information that the human eye or the human mind cannot comprehend when we are given a full time series of images like this. It's a bit like when you go to get a 3D scan for a CT scan of your body. The radiologist is going to look slice by slice, scrolling through the 2D slices with their mouth, whereas an algorithm can look at the whole volume in one go and get much more integrated view of the information this way. So what the cloud team has done here, by looking at the whole time series rather than independent snapshots, allows to precisely extract all this information in a way that the algorithms almost has an unfair advantage here. The use of unsupervised learning is, I mean, I'm a fan of mixture of experts. And when you put your slide, and we use a neural network to decide which expert, to me, I was like, duh, of course. It threw me back to 2008 when I was using mixture of experts with, very simple nonlinear activations. And it said, yeah, wait, of course a neural net. Why did I not think of that? So I really love this angle of mixing the old and the new to get something really powerful. And the unsupervised learning, I mean, much as a lot of the current tools that we are seeing on the day-to-day are based on supervised training, when you show the image and the label to the algorithm you're training, the real future is to tap into the huge amount of data for which you do not have labels. And that's where your team are going. That you gloss briefly over the marginalization of the circulation. And again, for the audience there, I just want to attract the attention on this little gem that just slides by almost unseen in the work, which is you got to your work, you got the causality model, and then you hit a wall. As in, oh, damn, the model depends on the circulation, and we do not have the data, and we cannot get it. And that's a point where, you know, a lot of people would just be like, well, we're doomed, what do we do? And you briefly allude to the hours on the whiteboard, and for having been in that kind of situation, I can see all the derivation there. And what's magic with this quick word of marginalization means, okay, we don't know squat about this data, about this behavior. You know what, let's integrate over it. Let's sum over all the probabilities, all the possibilities, and let's make a massive average on all that. And that is a real probabilistic thinking. That is a real power of both having to formalize it in a mathematical way where you're able to isolate this quantity that can be then integrated. But it's also the real thinking of, okay, let's look at the whole thing in probability and take into account all the possibilities. I really, really love that aspect. In terms of the next steps where you are heading with that, I mean, obviously the applications on climate change and on being able to, well, we're going to control the pollution, but in doing so, I mean, you scared the death out of me. You know, we're going to reduce pollution. We might actually heat things up. And it reminded me of a project that's ongoing at Oxford, who's looking at geoengineering. And that scares me. Okay, let's use geoengineering to put aerosol, silver aerosol in the air to make more clouds and avoid all of us completely frying right now. And there's a lot of debate around whether that should be done or not. But all your work here is going to be to allow domain experts to run what-if scenarios. There are some theories that geoengineering has been used locally during, say, the Olympic Games in certain parts of the world. There's a lot of question there. And tools like that you are developing allow precisely the exploration of these scenarios, both the worst case, best case, and pretty much everything we can throw at these gigantic problems. So I can't believe you've done that in just 8 weeks. It blows my mind, and I can't wait to see the paper and to see all of that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian. All right. Well, it sounds like we need a digital twin for Earth. I wonder if we should change gears and start looking at the next team.